Today, more than half of the world's population resides in cities. But this has been a relatively recent development, historically speaking. In 1800, only 3% of the world's population was urban, and by 1900, there are only a dozen cities with a population of 1 million citizens or more. Today, there are more than 400 of those kinds of cities. Of course, not all cities are created equal. Some are extremely modern, symbols of our current levels of sophistication, and others are not so much. Regardless, in this unit, we will investigate a tale of a few cities. Of course, there's no better place to start than the beginning, with the first urban revolution. Now, urbanism is a process in which cities grow. So if you take a look, egalitarian societies, or societies in which you have basically hunters and gatherers, they persisted even after the first agricultural revolution had begun 12,000 years ago. Regardless, the first urban revolution began around 8,000 years ago, likely in the Fertile Crescent, the same region in which Mesopotamia developed the great city of Babylon in the 2nd century BC. The urban-rural distinction could basically be determined what was inside the walls and what was outside the walls. Now, the first cities were based on non-primary activities. So primary activities being the extractive sector, we're talking about manufacturing in the secondary sector, or other things in the service sector, in the tertiary. Looking at the earliest civilizations, we can see that the formative era, or the era in which they started to become into being, was around between 7 to 5,000 BC. As you can see, first in Mesopotamia, then later in the Nile, Indus Valley, and so on and so on. This is the development where you actually had the first beginning of city-states and massive urbanization. What happened was you had stratified societies, no longer these egalitarian societies. And you had a hierarchy of social classes. At the top end of the hierarchy, you had the urban elite, these decision makers who controlled resources and lives. These thinkers and leaders were likely the ones to develop government, writing, record keeping, and the establishment of codified laws. In reality, most likely the first people to develop writing were accountants. If you had leaders who wanted to know how many heads of cattle you had or how much grain you had, you needed to come up with a system for symbols and for numbers. In this map, you can see 5 hearths of urbanization. Most likely the first one being around Mesopotamia, then later on into the Nile, Indus Valley, the Huanghe, and later on in Mesoamerica. With the onset of the first agricultural revolution, if you have an agricultural surplus and social stratification, you can have cities. Now we'll take a look at a few different areas in which urbanization developed at different times throughout history. Now, at the time of Mesopotamia, it was very important that the location was someplace that was fertile, that was defensible, also was around navigable rivers, places like those. Now, the cities were protected by earthen walls, as you can see this computer rendition of Ur, which was in Mesopotamia a long time ago. Now, being as people walked from place to place, the poorest were found on the outskirts of town, and the richest were toward the center. These cities also served as religious centers. You can see temples, or ziggurats, which dominated the landscape, usually in the inner area, often built on mounds. Since space was a premium, you often saw narrow lanes in between the homes. And of course, there was no waste disposal, so garbage was dumped in the middle of the streets. And because of this, disease kept the populations pretty small. Usually at most you saw 10 to 15,000 people per city. Of course, at that time, that was a pretty large number. Of course, looking at another region, we move on to Greece, which had a worldwide impact in terms of its influence, and of course had a massive impact in Western Europe. Now, virtually every city had an acropolis, a Parthenon as you can see here, for example. So these, as well, were also religious centers. And the best structures were built on the high point of the city. You also would have an agora, in many cases, a market. These were public spaces that were designed in the lower point of a city with steps, usually going down towards the center. People did all kinds of things here. They debated, they lectured, they planned wars. That's where we get the term today, agoraphobia, which means the fear of open spaces. Of course, the opposite of claustrophobia. Even though they had some more modern-looking structures, you still had a lot of the people in not much of a better situation than you had in Mesopotamia. Many of the people were in poorer houses. And for the vast majority, there was no sanitation of any kind either. Of course, one major innovation that the Greeks did was the grid system. This was a much more organized way of facilitating transportation and movement within the city structure itself. It's hard to imagine modern cities today without the grid system. And then, of course, you have the Romans. Now, the Romans were not really inventors of a lot of great things, but certainly they took a lot of what the Greeks had done and improved on them. They had transportation networks that linked the urban places by road, by river, and by sea. They were able to move troops and merchants faster than any other civilization at that time. Like the Greeks, they also used a rectangular grid pattern. They also improved on other things, such as the agora going to a modern forum, or basically their market. And of course, they expanded from the Greek theater into the Colosseum. Now in this map, you can see the vast distribution of cities in the western provinces of the Roman Empire around circa 100 AD. And the collapse of Rome coincided with the disintegration of their urban system and the transportation networks. Now this graph will show you about the last 1,000 years in Europe by looking at relative temperatures and how they went up through the medieval optimum and down through the Little Ice Age and back up again into the modern era. Now the term pre-industrial Europe refers to the pre-industrial revolution. Of course, there were vast industries that did exist, just not the modern mechanized industries. But this medieval optimum was a time of warmer climate that expanded farmlands and aided Europe's recovery and the eventual defeat of the Moors. During this time, and of course before the European colonization in the 1500s, you have what was kind of referred to as an urban banana. This was a crescent-shaped urban zone across Eurasia, going from the Eastern empires from Japan, through the Koreas, through China, India, the other Islamic empires, and ultimately into Europe. Cities developed along the Silk Road, and many cities were located in the interior, not along the coasts, because that's where trade was, and that's where the money was, and that's where the cities were. Even in the 14th century, 80 to 90% of Europe's urban population was still inside the former borders of the Roman Empire. And around the middle of the 14th century, up through the 17th centuries, you had the coldest times of the Little Ice Age. The colder and drier climate forced farmers and peasants into the cities.
Wait a minute. This isn't my world. Disappointed!